All right, thank you everybody who's joined us. I'm Jordan Gans-Morse. I'm an associate professor of political science at Northwestern and faculty director of the Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies program. I want to thank Annalise REEES, the executive director of the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, and Ian Hurd, the director of the Weinberg College Institute for International Studies, International and Area Studies. And we have a phenomenal panel here today to talk about a very important issue related to specifically the military aspects of this war, of Russia's war on Ukraine. So I'm going to introduce everybody, and the plan and our format is that we're going to run this primarily as a question and answer session. I'll start off and give all our panelists one or two major questions, and we'll open everything up to the audience. We want to be able to get your questions on these important issues to our experts and have them give you information firsthand. So I'd like first to introduce Dominique Arel. He's the professor of political science and chair of Ukrainian studies at University of Ottawa. We have Dmitry Gorenburg joining us. He's a senior research scientist of the Russian Studies program at CNA, an associate of the Harvard University Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. We are hoping that Sergei Glebov, the associate professor and deputy dean of the Faculty of International Relations, Political Science, and Sociology of the Odessa Menshikov National University, will be joining us directly from Odessa. He was in touch a little while ago and was traveling and was still saying last I heard from him he's going to try to join. I told him if he can't be right on time to jump in if he can. And so that would be very special and unique, obviously, if we can make that happen. We also have my colleague, Will Reno, professor of political science and chair of the political science department at Northwestern University, and my other colleague, Yohanan Petrovsky-Shtern, the Crown Family Professor of Jewish Studies and Professor of History at Northwestern University. And thank you, all of you, for joining us during these difficult times. Dmitry, let's start with you. As many people who are familiar with this part of the world know, you are an expert in military matters. And for those of us certainly who are part of the audience, but as I was saying to you guys before we got online, even for those of us who know the region but don't particularly specialize in military matters, it's been quite what we've seen unfold is very different than what was predicted. There seems to have been a significant underestimation of the capacity of Ukraine's military and an overestimation of Russia's military. Could you give us some insights on what you think is going on?
Sure, yeah. So I think the Russian military had a plan that didn't match the circumstances. They had this idea that they could quickly make a run for Kiev, that Zelensky and his government would flee, and that they could take over more or less uncontested. And they really didn't seem to have a plan B. So what we saw was that there was a lot more Ukrainian resistance than they expected. And I'll just, I'm not an expert on the Ukrainian military, so I probably will say less about why that was and the capabilities of the Ukrainian military. I just am not as familiar with that. But we see just on the ground that there's obviously the Ukrainian military has performed better, certainly, than Western analysts expected and better than the Russian planners expected. So what happened was that the Russian military, I think, maybe bought into some of their own propaganda that the Ukrainians would, or at least a sizable portion of the Ukrainian population would welcome them as liberators. And that obviously didn't happen. And so they encountered a lot more resistance. Their initial plans were not, they seem to not be operating the way they usually practice fighting, which is with these combined kind of battalion tactical groups and so forth. Instead, they had these smaller units that were kind of running off on their own as fast as possible for, Kiev in particular, but also some of the other, in the south as well. A little more successfully, by the way, in the south. They've taken quite a bit more territory coming out of Crimea than they did in the north. And so you had a situation where they outran their supply lines. They were traveling down major roads in convoys that were kind of easy targets. You can disable a convoy, a column pretty easily by taking out, the first and last tank, for example, that sort of thing. And then the whole thing kind of becomes somewhat immobilized. and so they didn't perform very well. And that then, in those first kind of 2 or 3 days of the fighting, that created a situation where the Ukrainian resistance was heartened, right? They felt better about their chances. The Russian military was caught by surprise. They started running out of supplies. We do know one other factor, which is that a lot of the lower ranking officers and certainly the soldiers were not told that they were going to be fighting in Ukraine. They thought in many cases they were just on an exercise and then were suddenly thrown in there. So they didn't have the, from a morale point of view, they weren't prepared psychologically for this. And so that's where we see some cases of Russian soldiers surrendering, abandoning their equipment, and that sort of thing. So all of this creates kind of a morale dynamic that then kind of creates these cycles where the Russian military performs worse, the Ukrainian military worse than expected, the Ukrainian military performs better than expected. The one note of caution though here is that worse than expected for Russians and better than expected for Ukrainians is still, we're still in a place where the Russians are gaining territory, although slowly, right? Like this does not mean that, and this is something that I think in some of the media analysis gets left behind, in that it's not that the Russians are losing and that the Ukrainians are winning. It's that it's much closer to a stalemate than anyone expected, right? So maybe I'll stop there for now and go on.
Thank you very much. I definitely want to get to everybody else, but just one quick follow-up question to you on this point about sending in soldiers to battle who apparently, in some cases, if we're to believe the videos, didn't even know they were fully in Ukraine until they were already being attacked, but which maybe is implausible, but certainly seems to be, from what I've seen, solid evidence that at least they were only told the very last minute that they were crossing the border into Ukraine for a real war, as opposed to training exercises on the border of Ukraine. Does this have precedent for Russia? Is this part of military doctrine? Were you surprised by this?
So, I mean, we don't have a lot of, other cases of that we can compare to. Certainly, when they've operated in Syria and they went to Chechnya, they knew where they were going. In some cases they didn't want to go there, but Chechnya, for example, but it wasn't that. I think this is more of a case where there was so much secrecy about the operation that even a lot of government officials at fairly high levels in Russia didn't know that this was coming. And this is, there was this really funny kind of weird dynamic in the media and sort of public perceptions prior to the invasion, where all of these Western analysts, particularly ones who are focused on the military, were looking at what was, the way the forces were set up and what was happening, and said, look, Russia's going to invade Ukraine. And the people who were in Russia, who were talking to their friends who were probably, in some cases were in government or, associated with, and they were all saying, no, this is just a bluff. This is, just, Russia's just trying to put pressure on Ukraine. This isn't a real thing. And so this kind of now makes a little more sense to me, because the people in Moscow who were connected didn't know, right? And so that's sort of, and they were talking to the analysts, and so they didn't know. Then they thought, well, this is not happening. Whereas our analysts were talking to U.S. government officials who seemed to have really good intelligence that it was happening, right? Now, that's another story, right? Like, how is it that our intelligence people seem to know what, I have no idea, and I don't want to speculate, but there seems to be some good intel on Putin's inner circle, I guess.
For sure, for sure. Thank you so much. Dominique, you've been working on a book along with Jesse Driscoll, the University of California, San Diego, that either I believe is already come out or is shortly going to come out, on the war in Donbass since 2014. Could you give us some insights on what's going on in that part of the country, and why we're perhaps not hearing as much about that as about what's going on in Kharkiv and Kiev and other major cities, particularly given that this was where the initial mass of Russian troops on the border showed up and where there already has been a war going on for some time?
Yeah, sure. Maybe Cindy can make me a co-host so that I can show a map. It'll be easier for the audience.
I think you're set up to share.
I'm already set up. Okay, great.
So give it a shot.
Whoops. Let's see. Let me try again. Sorry about that. I need to open this. Okay, that should work now. Second. All right, I've got my map here.
Fantastic.
Okay, well, the book was set to come out in September, will be delayed by a few weeks now because we need to redo the conclusion. Obviously, the book is not about the current war. It is about everything before the war, but no one could expect a full-scale war. So on the question of Donbass, the official name of the war, which because it's a war, our book is called The Unnamed War, but referring to the Donbass war of the last 8 years. And of course, Russia doesn't want to name the war right now. It's calling it a military operation to protect Donbass, or for the protection of Donbass. And on the claim that a genocide is underway in Donbass, in these self-proclaimed republics. So the first point is that obviously there is no genocide. And second, very important, is that the war in Donbass in 2014 had a civilian toll that United Nations estimated at least 2,000, between 2,000 2,500 civilians were killed during the military encounters in Donbass in 2014, in early 2015 through February. And the reason was you had a small scale version of what you're seeing now, is that artillery was used and in cities or aimed at cities, and civilians got in the way. I have to be clear here. You didn't have like indiscriminate shelling of cities like we're seeing now, but you had a civilian toll. And since 2015, 95%, if not more, of deaths in Donbass were military, because the war turned into a war of attrition along the front, essentially. The front being here, this whole front here between the Ukrainian army and the pro-Russian army, propped by the Russian army for 8 years. So in the last 7 years, this was no longer a war with civilian casualties of any significance. Of course, life in these areas was terrible. And so the civilian cost was enormous, and 1 million plus left. But the civilians were no longer hit. So this whole genocide is a complete fabrication. It's a monstrous lie. That being said, your question is what's happening militarily in Donbass? Well, as far as I can tell, nothing in the core Donbass. That is, this is the one area in the entire Ukraine where you don't have missiles being used. You don't have military encounters. That's the safest area, ironically. But I'm referring to these unrecognized republics that were recognized by Russia like 2 weeks ago. But the absolutely horrific images that we're seeing from Mariupol, well, guess what? Mariupol is right here. Mariupol is Donbass. So the military operation to protect Donbass has turned into an indiscriminate attack, a terror attack really, on In particular, but not, I mean, you've got obviously many other cities like Kharkiv, Irpin, Chernihiv, the list is very long. But first and foremost, on Donbas towns. The largest being Mariupol, because it's almost 500,000 people. And we see it is really a terror attack with no military significance. The intention is basically to break the morale and the resistance of the civilian population. That is the objective. There's no question about it anymore. But right at the front, and the cities are not names, you had towns that have been leveled to the ground. So you do have military encounters, but not on this side of the border, but on the other side with the Russia-backed rebel troops attacking here in Luhansk. You had the town of Shastia that was raised 80%, and another town, Volnovakha. There are like Mariupol, absolute humanitarian catastrophes, but the cameras, there were few cameras there, so we heard less about them. So what's happening in the rest of Donbass is a systematic attack on Russian-speaking Donbass towns in the name of protecting Donbass.
It's hard. It's hard to have words for what to say about that. Could you say one more thing too about the area around Dnipro and recent reports about this effort that, or I shouldn't say recent because it keeps coming up over and over again, that there's concern about an effort to encircle a large portion of the Ukrainian army, which was originally pushed out towards that area where the ongoing Donbass war had been, thinking that a heavy invasion would come from that area. And periodically, every couple of days, I see reports that there's concerns that from the south and the north, there's kind of a pincer formation that's going to pin in a large amount of the Ukrainian military. How much of the Ukrainian military is there, and how big of a risk is that they're going to be encircled?
To be honest, I don't have the specific information. I know that for obvious reason, the largest component of the Ukrainian army during these 8 years was at the front in Donbass itself. How much of that army was moved prior to the war? I can't answer that. That's an excellent question that will need to be researched. But the danger of a pincer formation, because you've got basically from the north in the Kharkiv region, and there's three fronts in the north, right? The Chernobyl all the way to Kiev, there's Sumy, and then Kharkiv. And in the south, Dima says that, slowly and grindingly, the Russian military is making advances. It's particularly kind of evident in the south, actually. The first major town that fell under Russian occupation was Kherson, which is right north of Crimea, and then going all the way to Mariupol, to Zaporizhia. You see it on maps that they're making advances. That is the fear, that clearly there's still a sizable, even if I can give you the proportion, number of troops, because they expected, if there is to be an attack, it will come from Donbass. It happens, but it happened in 4 different places as well. And so we've got 5 different fronts. And the weakest front, it would seem, was the southern front, which is why they're making so much advances.
Yeah, I actually want to share a map, if I could, just really quickly. Let me see if can let me see. Here we go. I have to just scroll down a bit here. This is from a presentation that I gave actually about 10 days before the war started, and this was sort of the most likely. This is a map I pulled from CSIS, but this is the most likely invasion routes that people were expecting, and you can see that a lot of this actually is exactly what happened. So if you look at the maybe less so the purple lines in the middle, like the Kremenchuk, kind of the big arrow from Belgorod to Kremenchuk, but that southern line, with Melitopol, these are cities that are in the news, right? Melitopol, you see Mariupol is surrounded, and then Kherson has fallen. That's the other southern city there. The one thing, and then the green ones in the north is pretty much how they attack Kiev, with The one difference being that nobody expected them to go through the Chernobyl exclusion zone, but they did. Right. So instead of going around, I mean, they did that too, but they also just went through the Chernobyl exclusion zone. So this is just to show that this was sort of, and you see, the middle lines. That's kind of, there's been less of an advance. They've been there's been less forward movement towards like Dnipro and Kremenchuk. It's more come from the south because that's where it was more successful. So Zaporizhia, is approached more from the south rather than from the east. But I just wanted to show you this because it kind of shows that this is kind of what was expected, and this is pretty much what they've carried out. So I'll stop sharing.
Great, thank you so much. Will, can we turn to you? You've done lots of research throughout your career on insurgencies, and I know that recently you've been conducting research on questions also of foreign military aid, and one case you've taken some look at is preparation of Ukraine for a potential guerrilla war. What's your sense of how likely that this is where this war is going to evolve towards eventually, and in terms of eventually cities falling to sieges and then this turning into some sort of partisan resistance? And if that does occur, what's your sense of how the war evolves from there?
Okay, to address that question, I think there are two levels. One is an operational / tactical one. So I'll do that first. But I think it's also really important to understand it in the context of a strategic analysis that involves Russia, the United States, NATO, and so forth, beyond Ukraine. So at the operational level, what's interesting about it, I'm not a Ukraine expert per se, but I am an expert in foreign military training. So recently visiting Poland, also at the Baltic Military College in Tartu in Estonia. What's been happening in terms of U.S. military relationships, NATO military relationships with Ukraine, of course, 2014 is really important. It changes pretty significantly after that, because the analysis, I think, among military in the United States was that Ukraine had this kind of, the older officers were a little Soviet, in organizational culture, and I don't think they thought very much of the military capacity of Ukraine's armed forces. But what started happening in 2015 under the Obama administration is something called Title 10 Authority training operation. So in other words, this is American Special Forces. It's through a channel legislation 333. So groups like 10th Group based at Fort Carson and Green Berets begin working with Ukrainians, but what they're doing is they're working with Ukrainians in the United States primarily because they want to try to make it as unprovocative as possible to Russia. One of the questions I think that a lot of people like I had was, to what extent are they really transferring skills? So this included things like Green Beret training for armed resistance under occupation. And sort of the other network that I think was significant is that the Lithuanians and Poles have more recently been cooperating with Ukrainian armed forces for pretty much the same thing. And then there's sort of a separate network from the Baltic states. One of the things I think is really interesting is that these Eastern NATO member countries, they have very small units that were engaged pretty effectively in Afghanistan. So that's on a personal and on a professional level. I think that network's important. And what they were doing is working with some elements of Ukrainian intelligence services and armed forces to, even though Ukraine's very big, to set up what they call a small country defense strategy, make it like a porcupine. And within Ukraine, I think that was also the government's perspective. So you had this expansion of, basically sort of the equivalent would be like American National Guard. So about 500,000 people, maybe with 1 million firearms, that it's pretty minimal training, but what's important is sort of that change in the mindset. And my observation too is that in Kiev they were pretty effective at not necessarily trying to reform the whole military, but trying to find other networks, other organizational structures, building things that could supersede that old military and use very effectively, for example, of military intelligence. So I think when a commander of Ukraine's military intelligence special operations, what was that guy's name? Shavpavol, was blown up in a car bomb, basically. There you go. That's a good indicator that somebody else was concerned, that these folks were very effective. So I think that the military is able to fight, and I would expect it to be, pretty effective as a guerrilla force under occupation. One of the questions is, would such a force expand attacks into Russia, into urban areas, for example, and what sort of, if it were a different group, we would call terrorist attacks. So the objective, and this gets to the sort of the larger framework strategic picture, the US national interest in this and European NATO partners' interest in this is they want to make the invasion and occupation of Ukraine very expensive. And that they figure this is the only way that they can change Russian behavior. Because what we have to realize is Russia has nuclear weapons, we have nuclear weapons. What we're engaged in right now is a vicious diplomacy. It's a nuclear diplomacy. And we cannot do things like have no-fly zones, because what this will lead to is the engagement of Russian and NATO soldiers. That should be off the table between nuclear armed powers, because what we have to do is we have to avoid escalation, but what we can do is we can communicate through violence, through proxies and so forth, and other actions which are being read by an adversary and vice versa. So I think US-Russian military-to-military connections are pretty good right now. They're not necessarily friendly, but we are engaged in nuclear diplomacy. And unfortunately, and this is, I think, sort of the cold, brutal truth, is that at this point, we cannot give a great deal of material assistance to Ukraine's armed forces and to possible guerrilla forces under occupation. There's some, but we have to be always very mindful of this problem of escalation in a nuclear world. So aircraft coming from US military bases into Ukrainian airspace, can't do that. Can't share real-time intelligence with Ukrainian fighters as if they were avatars of American soldiers. It's tricky. British government signaling that maybe people can leave UK with military skills as private citizens and go to places like Odessa and so forth. If you look at the Cold War, there are these little gray zones, and there are things that you can do. It's sort of like Stinger missiles in Afghanistan shooting down low-flying Soviet aircraft and these types of things. So we have a playbook, but what's happening is, as Dmitry pointed out, the original Russian plan, it's pretty clear it was a 48, 72-hour thing. And they really screwed up big time. And the strategic interest of the United States, and as much of the rest of the world as the United States can partner with, is to hurt that strategy through strengthening ground forces in Ukraine. Hopefully that training worked, because we can't do a whole lot right now. And there's a timeline to this too. Is Russia going to have an economy in June? What is a hard truth in this type of environment is survival is winning. It may mean cities get destroyed, cities can survive a long time under siege. You know, Mosul, when it was under Islamic State, they held on for about a year and a half under siege. It did not look good. You know, I think in the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s, you saw siege too. So we've seen sort of what's going to happen, but we also have a ticking clock because the elite in Russia, we can't do anything in Russian domestic politics. This audience is the Russian audience looking at the escalating cost of a strategic blunder and that insurgency and that small unit irregular warfare holding on. What it's doing is it's raising the strategic cost to Russia to the point where probably this will be a strategic failure for Russia. And at that point, it's still a very dangerous world because we have to figure out what's the exit ramp, because we don't want them to give up and decide that they're going to follow a bad strategy by pouring on more quantity, which they'll do initially, because that'll only make matters worse. And I think there are people in Russia that understand this pretty well, people with information. Maybe they have to give good reports or whatever to the boss, but they realize they're up to their neck in it. And unfortunately, what we have to do is we have to give them time to figure out what they're going to do about that, but do it where we are not causing escalation in a nuclear world. And, you know, there's a moral dimension to this as well, because there are a lot of people out there that you meet in military training. They're going to be in Ukraine who are going to die. And that is their motivation. That is their choice. But this is the brutal, vicious diplomacy of a multipolar world where we now have a conflict that involves two, well, if you include the Europeans, 4 nuclear armed powers. So I'll cut it off there. I'll apologize. I'll have to run out at some point soon because I got to travel. And when the car comes, I'm out. So
thank you for joining us. And I want to get to Yohanan in a minute and hear about some historical perspective, but I wanted to ask the other 3 of you on the panel to say more about this issue that Will just raised about the no-fly zone. And I mean, certainly, I think many people in the world and many of us in this panel will understand what you're saying about the risk of nuclear escalation, and particularly for those of us who maybe know the region but don't work on these issues, but have ties to the region, you know, professional ties, personal ties. What you're saying is very difficult to hear because it's a huge sacrifice that Ukrainians are going to bear, and not just the Ukrainian armed forces. Because not only can civilians not get out and still to a significant extent, but no, you know, all males, as is well known now, all males 18 to 60, from at least the people I'm talking to, most want to stay, but even if they don't, they can't leave, right? So there's not a whole lot of choice here in terms of who's going to be stuck on the immediate painful side of the strategy. I'm curious if everyone else agrees that a no-fly zone, because it's coming up in the questions from the audience as well, that a no-fly zone absolutely has to be off the table. And there's also some questions here, as well as, you know, in the press and some prominent people saying that there are options short of a full no-fly zone, which would, you know, as is becoming increasingly clear in discussions in the news and so on, would involve things like having to take out anti-aircraft installations on Russian territory probably, but that there might be some option of a more humanitarian no-fly zone that's more limited and would not involve an attack on Russian defenses to begin with. What do the 3 of you, other than Will, think about this no-fly zone issue?
Sure. Look, I think Will is absolutely right. There's no such thing as a more limited no-fly zone. That's just either, because the only way there's 2 kinds of no-fly zone in this case. Either the Russians agree to it, in which case you could have humanitarian and all sorts of things, but then it's not a no-fly zone. It's just, you know, an agreement to limit air operations over a certain area, right? Or they don't agree to it, in which case the purposes of it or the geographic area of it doesn't matter, because if the Russians contest it, then you're in a position where you have to either shoot down Russian aircraft, destroy Russian air defense systems, or it's not a no-fly zone, or you give up and go home, right? It's like so these kinds of conceptions of, oh, we'll declare that it's only for humanitarian reasons. That only works if the Russians accept that. And so I think that I could just repeat everything Will said about the reasons why it's doesn't work from a NATO-Russia confrontation point of view, but there's no reason to say it again. So.
If I can come in briefly. Of course, and I'm not a military or a strategic expert, and that's not what I do. So obviously, I can only agree with Will and Dima and all the experts that are telling us, that would be breaking the taboo and, direct confrontation, escalation, nuclear war. Russia maybe would shoot a missile to Riga. Who knows, right? It's all true. But what we're seeing now is the terror attack on cities and the absurdity, and I said even in Donbass, right? The Russian speakers, those who used to be previously pro-Russian, they can't understand it, that Russia's attacking them. I mean, now you've got the bombing of Kharkiv, that used to be a stronghold of the Party of Regions. But what if, because we're heading in that direction, they started doing it in the suburbs. What if the terror policy is now applied to Kyiv? Will the world, will Europe, will NATO stand by? I mean, Kyiv, a European capital, razed to the ground like Warsaw in 1944, while the Soviet army just waited for the destruction. Maybe because of the risk of escalation, maybe, but I'm not 100% sure. That's all I have to say. I'm not sure that that NATO, the United States, will let the destruction of Kyiv on live TV. I don't know.
That's an important piece to add in as well, just in that this is really, and I don't usually put plugs in for Tom Friedman, op-eds in our Northwestern events, but I mean, this was the first thing, not surprisingly perhaps, that he wrote when Russia invaded, was we're about to see something unlike anything we've ever seen, because we're in a social media age, and a developed country with good, not just good social media, high levels of social media use, but with strong ties to the Western world, right? To the rest of the Western world, to Europe and America. And we're about to see this up front in a way that we don't usually have to watch. And that's going to fundamentally change dynamics. So that's certainly something that I think we should circle back to. I do want to get to Yohanan. Was anyone else on the no-fly zone at this moment?
I need to leave in 10 minutes. Is that okay?
Well, can we get you to, oh God, okay. Yohanan, let's turn to you. And if you'd like to add more on the no-fly zone, by all means, and then also want to turn to your expertise as a historian and get some sense of how historic traditions inform what we're seeing in terms of the Ukrainian resistance.
Our conversation went in one direction, and I don't think that it leaves me much time to discuss historical ramifications and prehistory of this major historical calamity that Putin calls a limited military operation to secure Donbass and Luhansk republics, and everybody else in the world calls full-fledged war against Ukraine. So I would like to start by strongly disagreeing with Dima and Bill. I do think that what they are saying about the no-fly zone, that this is something that should be off the table, that the United States cannot secure, cannot and should not be even considering, I find it, ridiculous. And I would like to introduce one player into the discussion that will change everything. And this player is Mr. Putin. Because you folks, you are discussing the situation, the view of no-fly zone from the point of view of the United States and NATO. And you are quite right to do so, because you are thinking in terms of very good, very thoughtful and sophisticated and experienced chess players. But you are playing not with another chess player. You are playing with a gangster who plays without any rules, who establishes his own rules, who whatever he does, whatever he says, flies in the face of the international law, and he is ready to violate, and he violates any kind of international law and rules that you call escalation. He is seeking escalation. If you think that Putin would not find pretext to say that NATO is attacking him, that NATO is behind Kyiv resistance, excuse me, you do not know who you are dealing with. You do not know what kind of evil person, what kind of twisted mind is on the other side of the spectrum. So you are saying, okay, let's avoid escalation as soon as possible. Now let's do whatever we can not to go into no-fly zone. And the person on the other side of the table is saying, aha, they are afraid. They don't want me to provoke them. I will find the way to tell them that they are already there on the ground. I will find the way to say that the United States is supporting Kyiv militarily, and I will make a point to attack the NATO countries and to do whatever I can to engage other countries into that war, into that conflict. Why so? Because he is not a chess player, he is a gangster. This is something to take into consideration. Therefore, I'm considering everybody who is saying no-fly zone over Ukraine a coward. Whatever you think about me, but I am just telling you what I'm feeling, and I'm much more with Dominique than with Will and Dima, who are excellent military experts who are playing according to the chess rules. We are not playing the chess game here. That is to be considered. Number two, Dima said something that strikes me as an important thing. Why do people say those captured POWs from the Russian side, why they are saying that they do not know where they are going? Can it be the case that they really do not know that they are sent to Ukraine? And I would, Dima mentioned that there is no, comparative framework for that. I would like to use Bill's reference and say, yes, there is a comparative framework. Well, I witnessed in the Soviet Union what was going on in Afghanistan in 1979, 1980, 1981, before the withdrawal of the troops under Gorbachev from Afghanistan. And I do remember that some of my classmates from Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, from Moscow, were telling me that at a certain point, the documents were taken from them. They were told that they will be flown somewhere for a military training, for some sort of maneuvers, what they call that. And they were actually brought to the mountains of Afghanistan. They descended and they were asked to deploy, let's say, radio set connections and other kind of communications. And several people were wounded in the unit that I'm talking about. And they were moved back to the Soviet Union. Nobody knew where they were, where had been wounded, and of course that was the way to cover the number of the Soviet troops in Afghanistan. That is the same tactics the Russians are doing in Ukraine. They are taking the documents from the troops sent to Ukraine. They are telling people, they are instructing those who might be taken prisoners, tell those who imprison you that you do not know where you were sent, it was a mistake, and so on and so forth. This is part of a very well premeditated military propaganda. So, but of course, the Afghanistan backdrop is very important for what the Russians are doing today in Ukraine. And the third thing, I would like to share my map for a second, and maybe I'll stop there. Let me show my map. When we're looking at the map, and we are asking a question, what is going on in Ukraine? Of course, this map shows, it's a traditional map, right? It shows the movement of the troops and the control of the territory, as we see on the maps of, let's say, Napoleonic invasion in Russia in 1812, or the movement of Austrian and Russian troops through Galicia in 1915. It's a very traditional map, and what it doesn't show something important that we have to take in mind. Russian troops move far and fast, but they do not control the territory which is designated on this map as allegedly under Russian control. So this, you can say, might be a Russian territory. This is a Russian territory. This is a territory controlled by Russian troops, but it is not. Russian troops control hardly the roads that connect southern Belarus and Kiev. They hardly control the roads connecting southeastern Belarus and Chernihiv. They do not connect the roads in the south. Yes, they besieged and then they managed to take control of Kherson, Kakhovka, and Melitopol, but they do not control the territory between them. These territories are under the control, nobody's control. They are gray areas, and there is a lot of guerrilla resistance occurring there. So that is something about this war we have to take into consideration, that these arrows do not indicate that the entire territory underneath them, so to say, is under Russian control. And when I'm looking at this map, Jordan, you have to tell me how much time do I have, because
give it another 30 seconds or so, because I want to come back to several things you're bringing up and see what everyone else has to say in response.
So if you make any kind of comparison and you consider that today is March 10th, right, more than 2 weeks of the war, you ask a question. Russia has 15 times more better equipped army in terms of helicopters, aircraft, navy, and artillery. And what is going on, and of course, let alone the armored vehicles and tanks. Ukraine use T-62 and Russia uses T-84, which is a much more advanced, modernized vehicle. So what is going on? Why Russians moved not more than 100 kilometers into the Ukrainian territory after 2 weeks of that, so to say, blitzkrieg? By that time, the Nazi troops managed to get from Eastern Germany through the territory of Poland and get to the town known as in Russian history as Brest, and in Polish history as Brest-Litevsky. So in 2 weeks, the Nazi troops managed to get through the entire country and capture most of Poland. And Russian troops cannot move 100 kilometers into the territory. So that is something that we need to ask. So Dmitry explained what is going on in Ukraine, but I believe somebody needs to explain why what is going on is going on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yohanan. And you raise a number of issues that actually are coming up here in the questions from the audience. Get you to, unless it's helpful to keep this map up, we can do so, but otherwise feel free to take it down. And I just want to highlight several of them and see Dominique and Dmitry, if you guys have thoughts on this. So one thing that Yohanan, you talked about is, should we keep acting like Putin is the same thing as Khrushchev, and then, the Cuban Missile Crisis? Should we, or is this something fundamentally different? And certainly the view you're voicing is the one I hear from people in Ukraine all the time, that this is a madman, and the West is still acting as though we're dealing with a rational Soviet leader, and instead that's not the right analogy, and that's partly why they're okay with a fly zone. So I'd be very curious to hear, and I know people who are writing in are saying the same thing from others, whether we should think differently about Putin than we are. And related to that is that we know Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, keeps calling for a no-fly zone. We know that he has people around him with military expertise, and so they certainly understand all the same things that military experts are saying about the risk of escalation, and yet they're calling for it. And so I'm curious, how do we take that into account? They're the ones who are going to be in the middle of this no matter what, and so that would be something that seems interesting to understand why they're okay with that risk of escalation. And just one piece to add to this, as we're talking about these several things that also comes out from the audience here, the people who are viewing this panel, is what's the best case scenario that we can see to hold for Ukraine at this point?
You want to go first, Dima, briefly?
Sure. Let me talk about this question of whether Putin is a madman or not, and NATO also, because if Putin
I did not say
really,
that he's a madman. I did not say
well,
that.
no, I know you didn't, but
Gangster.
Jordan,
I use, those are my words, but gangster.
Yeah. But the setting, the madman, it's whatever. I don't think that's really that important. But the question of whether Putin is afraid of NATO or not is, I think, an important one, and that Yohanan, you did break. If he was not afraid of NATO, I would argue he would have attacked the Baltics. Maybe not now, maybe earlier, but NATO security guarantees mean something. This is why Ukraine is in the position that it's in, one of the reasons, there's two reasons. One, the main one is that Putin and other imperialist types in Russia don't think of Ukraine as a fully fledged nation. And they've made that very clear in various publications. That's the primary one. But there's a secondary one, which I think is also important, which is that they saw an opportunity to fix this mistake, right? And that is that they saw NATO as Ukraine becoming over the last several years as kind of a NATO outpost, and they've written about this and they've talked about this in terms of NATO doing more and more training of Ukrainian military, bringing in, providing military assistance, ships coming into Odessa, et cetera, et cetera. Because Ukraine was not a NATO member, Ukraine did not have the security guarantees and NATO made very clear that it would not defend Ukraine, right? At various points, including in the last few months, when invasion became more and more likely. And so from the point of view of Putin, and I think this is why Putin is very rational, actually, there was a potentially closing window of opportunity, because they took seriously something that we didn't mean seriously, which is that Ukraine will one day be a NATO member, the Bucharest Declaration of 2008. We saw it as kicking the can down the indefinite, into the indefinite future. They said, they looked at it and they said, oh, NATO says that Ukraine will one day be a NATO member. We better do something about that before it is. And so that, I think, explains to some extent, part of the timing. There's other factors that probably we don't have time to go into, but so there is actually a great deal of rationality, and Putin is actually does not want a conflict with NATO. And so the best argument to me for a no-fly zone is actually not the one that's been made, but the one that Putin is afraid of NATO and won't and will back off if NATO imposes this, right? The problem is that we're not that sure that he will, and the alternative is and if he doesn't back off, and there's also some evidence that Putin, as a gangster, reacts, doubles down when cornered, right? And so in that case, what we would see is a big war between NATO and Russia, and it would be very difficult to keep that war from not escalating to a nuclear war. And so that is the calculus that I mean, you can say they're cowards, you can if you want, but the leaders of the NATO member states and President Biden among them have made the calculation that they don't want to take that risk for Ukraine. Now, we can disagree with that. We can say that Ukraine is defending the liberal world order and the democracy and all those things, but that was something that has been consistent all along from before the invasion, and Biden knew the invasion was coming before Zelensky did, right? Or was convinced the invasion was coming before Zelensky was, and so nothing has changed since February 25th, except that the Ukrainians have done much better at defending themselves than anyone expected them to, right? And so this has caused the Russians to become more brutal, or the Russian army.
All right. Well, let me disagree with my dear friend Dima here.
I'm going to give you a couple minutes, Dominique, and then we'll go back to you for the final word.
I know we're 3 minutes left, so I'll be very, very brief.
No, take a couple and we'll get back to Yohanan the last. So
okay. I think what Putin did, and it's pretty clear, it's Putin. It's not the Russian leadership, because he's shown that he's basically able to take unilaterally a decision without consulting anyone, without even consulting his National Security Council. He has that unfettered power that no Russian leader has had since Stalin. It's no exaggeration. That is the situation right now in Russia. What he did was so radical. I mean, we can try to rationalize it afterward that yes, he feared NATO. NATO was already in Ukraine, or training, like the Canadians, the Americans, the Australians were training the Ukrainian army. We see the results now. It's all true. But it's so radical because absolutely no one in the West and even in Russia could have predicted that we would be in a full-scale war right now in February, March 2022. It's so out there, the first war of aggression in Europe since the Second World War, that I am not convinced by any argument that Putin will stop here or there because he's a rational actor. His whole war is based on a complete fabrication, not the NATO threat, but the fabrication that the Ukrainians are not real, but essentially those Ukrainians that are in power needs to be entirely removed. Like the final solution, that was one of the questions on the Q&A that came out. There's a document, the solution to the Ukrainian problem is let's extinguish the Ukrainian nationalists altogether and we will have complete security. So my point is the decision is so radical that how can we exclude other out there unimaginable radical moves by Putin, such as confronting NATO at some other time or maybe in the midst of the war. That's my take. Your question, Jordan, about what's the best case scenario. Right now, the best case scenario is still very grim, would be for Russia soon enough to come to a point when its policy of systematic terror in the cities, indiscriminately attacking civilians, becomes unsustainable. How can it become unsustainable? I don't know. It may have to do with just the pulverizing effect of the sanctions. I don't know. And that would lead to a stalemate. So that the best case position would lead to a more partitioned Ukraine. So with the territories in the north and in the south under some kind of Russian control, but the heart and Kiev and some of the major cities holding ground. I would say that's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is that the policy of terror eventually breaks the cities. But then we get into what Will was talking about. We get into insurgency, and we get into a situation where, because of the systematic attack and leveling of cities in eastern Ukraine, I mean, the war is in eastern Ukraine right now. And eastern Ukraine is supposed to be the Russian world. It's supposed to be the world that Putin wants to save from the fascists, from the nationalists. He completely annihilated, extinguished, vaporized any kind of support for Russia from any part of the political spectrum. So how can you in any way occupy a country when you have zero social support? But what you get with the insurgencies and chaos, and it's both a kind of a worst case scenario and then still something hopeful for the Ukrainians, because they will not simply be broken and become some kind of Belarus right now, like a vassal of Russia.
But at great cost, to say the least. We are over time already, but I want to give you a final word, Yohanan, for a minute or two, and then we'll wrap up. And
thank you. Regarding Baltics, my answer is Dima. Look, first, it was on Putin's plans, because he was planning to restore the Soviet Union, and not only the Soviet Union, he was thinking about a package deal, that is to say, restore the Soviet Union in its 1990 borders, plus the control of Romania, Poland, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia. And that was on his plan and what was forthcoming. But let me address another thing that we are discussing here. The decision of President Biden not to sacrifice the stability of that we have right now between the two nuclear powers, or the Russian Federation on the one hand and NATO countries on the other, plus China. Not to sacrifice it for the sake of Ukraine. So let me just remind you, let me ask you one question. So when Putin's troops invaded Georgia, nobody was ready to sacrifice the world's stability for the sake of Georgia. When Putin's troops created this proxy zone in Moldova, in Transnistria, they were also saying, no, we are not going that for Moldova. When Putin's troops controlled and annexed temporarily the Crimean Peninsula and parts of southeastern Ukraine, they were saying, no, we are not going to fight with Russia and confront Russia because of that. Now we are talking about the entirety of Ukraine. So look, Putin is raising the bar all the time. And those people who are advising the president are saying, okay, he will stop at some time. Well, look what? He did not stop 20 years ago. He's not stopping 12 years ago. He's not stopping in 2014. He's not stopping now. He is raising the bar. And that is a paradigm. And people who do not see this paradigm, excuse me, should take 101 history with me at Northwestern and not advise President Biden or anybody, because these people do not know how things work. Putin is increasing the threat, and he will at certain point when he gets, God forbid, the entirety of Ukraine, and he will then say, you know, NATO countries, get out of Baltics, they are mine, otherwise I'll start the war against you, a nuclear war with my 400 warheads or 4,000 warheads, excuse me. So the would-be president of the United States say, oh, what are these three countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia on the map? They are nothing. Let him take that. We would avoid the nuclear war. The person is seeking this kind of confrontation. And I believe it is a wonderful time right now to seek this confrontation and enter this confrontation, because Russian army does not exist as it existed on February 23rd, 2022. Ukrainians are taking down approximately $500 million worth of Russian armed vehicles, tanks, helicopters, and other type of munition, just by doing what they are doing. Okay, so Russian army is exhausted. And not entering the war now means, okay, let them reestablish themselves. And in 10 years, you will be doing with a different Russia. So that is a lack of strategic thinking, which is ridiculous to me, a person who has a literary PhD and a PhD in modern Jewish history. So that is just a lack of elementary understanding of how military works. Excuse me, folks, but I'm just blowing up here.
Well, thank you so much. And I know that I'm sure there could be an ongoing conversation about this for a long time. And this is in response to some things that people are writing in the questions and answers section here, asking for a longer conversation, ongoing conversation. We are out of time now, but as I put into the question and answer box, this is just the beginning of a series of events that we are going to be doing through the REEES program in collaboration with the Buffett Institute. I know many of my colleagues here are doing events all over the country at their respective institutions and at others. Many of the questions that are coming up here are ones that we're going to address bit by bit as we can in terms of questions of the diplomatic aspect of this, the nuclear, more about the nuclear aspect of this, more about the questions of nuclear energy and energy plants. I'm just listing some of the things that I'm seeing here. So I apologize that we've not been able to get to all of the important and pressing things that certainly need to be covered. I also just want to emphasize that we really appreciate the extent of interest, and I hope that it's clear to everybody that at minimum, even if it's far from clear what to do at this moment, and if we can have serious disagreements, that this is not just Ukraine's war. This is a war that already is affecting all of us, and that is, we are basically in a conflict, if we don't want to call it a war of NATO and Russia, but we're certainly in a NATO-Russian conflict. And Ukraine's just the one that is at the forefront of that, with Ukrainians dying. And so we really hope that through these events, we can make sure that Americans understand our own stake in this, that this is not just something that we're doing to help the Ukrainians, that Ukraine is helping us at this moment by all the sacrifices that they're making. And with that in mind, more information will be forthcoming. We'll at least weekly be holding events through REEES, and the Buffett Institute. And we certainly, whenever we can, we'll be bringing people in directly from Ukraine. I apologize that Sergei was not, it seems, able to join us today. For those of you who were at some of the earlier events that Buffett organized and REEES organized in recent weeks, we brought in people like Timothy Milovanov and Timothy Brick from the Kiev School of Economics. And just to use their words, they asked us, please don't talk about Ukraine without Ukrainians. And obviously Yohanan's a Ukrainian, and we have many other people here who have ties to Ukraine. But whenever we can, we want to be able to give people a voice who are actually right there dealing with this. And what's been remarkable is that scholars themselves, given this new information technology world that we live in, are still active, even as they are preparing to fight or fighting or resisting, and joining us in these panels because they want to be able to make their voice heard. So we will do everything we can to continue doing that. But I want to give express our gratitude again for all of you joining us, both in the audience and our panelists, and wish everybody well in this difficult time. And thank you so much.
Thank you.